Willkommen, bienvenue, welcome one and all to another Property Matters podcast with Hamish McLeod, Search Control, and myself, Gareth Wax of the Many Purple Hats. I should note that we would have had Wendy with us, but due to scheduling concerns and so on, she's not going to be with us until Friday. So look out for her then. For sage advice helps many. Today we're talking about the market specifically with a focus towards rents up, options down, and the tenant seems to be squeezed in between. Hamish, would you start us off?
Well, I will. It's one of those topics which we actually sort of find, like with so many others within the building industry, within construction, within property, that we go through different phases and different phases of popularity of different aspects.
Right.
And we are going through a phase at the moment where the rental market is having some adverse effects on what is basically sort of going on. And there are a number of reasons for that, but it's not all bad news. Well, it's actually thinking about it, it is all bad news, but some of it's not as bad as the others.
Right. So it's what you're saying. It's not totally bad.
No, right. Yeah, that's right. Yes, probably. We will let people judge for themselves what they feel on the matters we've discussed. We're not going into it any great depth because our 20 minutes don't give us that opportunity. But it's something to actually sort of point out to people, because there has been a shift, particularly in the last sort of 4 to 5 years. But it was started off really, as most of these things, with different sort of patterns. We had a government, a Conservative government at the time, decided that, oh, hang on, the rent to buy market and people buying all these properties to rent out seems to be increasing. It might be a good way for us to get some additional taxation here. So they started imposing all sorts of various things to make it not such a good idea.
Well, at that point, I'm going to give a quick brief because I was tasked by my Lord and Master to come up with a breakdown over the last 20 years. I'll rush through it as quick as I can. It's got 6 sections to it, which is the early 2000s, buy-to-let boom, and then 2008 to 2012, financial crisis, market shock. It would hit the housing market hard, mortgage lending tightening. 2013, 2016, rapid growth, investor confidence. That's when property prices rebounded strongly, particularly in London and South East, and they've never gone down since. And the private rented sector grew to about 20% of UK households. 2016, 2020, of course, regulation, tax changes, reducing mortgage interest relief, higher stamp duty to try and cool the buy-to-let market. And at that point, I would say that's when the first exodus of landlords from the property market was. And 2020, 2022, a little thing called a pandemic. City centre rents collapsed. People moved out of London and other urban hubs. Suburban and rural rental demand surged. So that was a temporary thing. By 2022, it had pretty much come back, but rising interest rates and inflation since 2022 have reshaped the sector entirely. Many landlords exiting due to higher borrowing costs and, of course, stricter regulations. The supply fell, which is the biggest issue I think we've got now. We've got an ever-increasing need, but not enough supply. Possibly ruined a little bit by the current cladding crisis that we talk about in Cladding Matters, because there are so many places that could be used for rentals but are held up by the fact that they're not rentable, not sellable, and certainly not insurable. The outlook overall is there's an affordability crisis. Rent is consuming between 30 and 50% of tenants' income. There's a policy focus issue. The government's under pressure to reform renting laws and improve tenant protection, and incentivize longer-term tenancies. And my perception of this is that sort of thing is like a swing of a pendulum. It used to be all the landlord's way. Now there's pressure to go all the tenants' way, and then there'll probably be a swing back again. But it's certainly in a shift. And the future trend is that there'll be a lot more institutional buy-to-rent, So big, huge companies building places to rent out at considerable cost. More regulation, so minimum engine efficiency standards and green agendas and so on, and continued demand from younger people. And the latest group of people who are part of the generation rent that we are part of right now, of course, are migrants who can't afford to buy like the rest of us. So, of course, they tag along and rent as well. It should be pointed out that they are also, by that definition, contributing to the overall economy. But that's where we're at. And it doesn't appear to be getting any easier to either buy and renting. My goodness, in order to rent, you have to demonstrate you can show the ins and outs of a cat's ass and Christ knows what else just to be able to start off. And the amount of money they want to offer you up front just to get started renting is as much as it was to start a blooming mortgage. It's not more. I don't know where it ends. Hamish?
Well, this is, you can actually hear from what Gareth said. There's been enormous change in 20 years because there have been some aspects beyond the control of the government, some aspects been reinforced and made more difficult by the government. What has actually sort of made the if you like, created the biggest of the challenges is the change in the advantages for people to buy into properties to rent them. And what is happening, and both governments are happy for all this to happen. And it's a sad thing because we hear about this sort of all over the place. With the larger the company, the more institutionalized that sort of becomes. And of course, everything gets that much tighter. And of course, the basic aspect is they are getting involved purely for profit. And if they're involved for profit, they're going to make sure their costs are met. As a consequence of that, as we well know, the affordability of properties to buy is significantly diminished at the moment. So that creates a challenge. We have the flats, which would be a great thing to actually move into if we didn't have the cladding issues there. But who's going to want to actually move into a property? Oh, it's up for rent. However, you've got this sort of 24-hour watch on the property to make sure it doesn't catch fire.
But Hamish, isn't that on the tens, if not hundreds of thousands of properties in that situation right now?
Oh, absolutely. So there's a big squeeze sort of right the way around. But one of the challenges, of course, it doesn't prevent the, if you like, I'm going to say the factory style, the larger landlords. When we speak about multiple, we're not speaking about hundreds. We speak about thousands of properties. Yep. They buy up massive great blocks and they rent out those blocks. I mean, the standards in some of those are very, very difficult for the poor old souls to sort of comprehend. And what does make it difficult, if you actually complain, they will actually sort of make it difficult for you to actually stay there. But unfortunately, the general direction is to push out the smaller landlords and increase the number of larger land, or not so much increase the number of. They don't want to increase the number of. They want to increase the holdings of the larger landlords. So basically, there's much tighter control on what's actually sort of going on, which is a bit unfortunate because the private landlord, the smaller ones, like small to medium businesses, contribute so much. And we have actually sort of seen, particularly, I mean, there's most recent government to actually sort of come to power who decided that they were going to look after everybody. That they made it very, very difficult. They've created unemployment because they put the costs up for small to medium business owners. Well, for all business owners, to be perfectly honest. Impact. Instead of taking extra additional people on, people can't afford to do it because of rising costs. And if you put the cost of employing somebody up, you're going to impact on that as well. So, unfortunately, all of these things are making it difficult for people to be able to afford the rent in any event. So we've got everything being squeezed in so many different directions. But the worst of it is, with the legislation which has been created and it gets tighter, if you're going to buy a property to rent out and you're finding out all these things are changing, what are the conditions going to be when you actually go to rent that property? Because there was one occasion, early days of the Labour government, they were actually sort of saying that, hey, hang on, basically landlords were really money grabbers and they really wanted to curtail them. They wanted to stop it.
There was definitely a cool down of landlords. It was there was pressure from the Labour government to try and make it harder and less attractive to do so.
And this is really what's happened. And big pressures. I think the average number of any property that comes onto the market straight away in the London arena, there'll be 8 inquiries go out about it. And in some of the really difficult areas, places like sort of Bristol, people actually queue up to view. And you've almost got this sort of gazumping type sort of thing. Before we have all this big rental reform coming in, we're having these threats about things are going to be changed. This is pushing landlords out, by the way, but it's enabling the landlords that currently are there to actually push the rents up before this particularly sort of happens. So all the way around, we've got pressure coming from so many different directions on the smaller landlord because the costs are taking it out. Of course, what happened when we had that massive upsurge, of course, in lending, going back a couple of years ago, from almost 0% straight away up to sort of 5%. It didn't impact on everybody initially, but what's happened, of course, people had to start renewing because they were fixed term mortgages, or they were actually sort of following certain trends. But because they've had to now reapply for mortgages, they're now looking at slightly different. Of course, they are much higher as well. So increase what they're paying for their mortgage, increase the amount of tax they now have to pay, reduce the number of things for what they can actually sort of claim the taxation. They've got 2 options. They can increase the rent, but the big problem with that is the people out there can't necessarily afford those bigger increases.
Right.
So they're finding that, well, hang on, I've got this thing. If I've got to struggle with this particular property, I may as well just put it on the market. So they pulled out. So the people who were residents in their particular properties, they are now in need of additional housing. So because we aren't meeting the house build that was intended, we've got, whichever direction we actually look now, there is, and it doesn't matter if it's the price, it doesn't matter if it's the numbers available, whichever way you actually sort of look at it, it is making it almost impossible for that particular sort of person to move out from their parental home to start off with, or to try and actually switch from where they are. If they move from where they are at a particular rent, if they move elsewhere, the rent is going to likely to be higher. So there's a whole squeeze on the market. So as a consequence of that, there isn't the demand in some respects. So with the reduction in numbers, and of course the increase, because immigration isn't ceasing at this particular sort of moment in time, and of course we're hearing more and more, aren't we, of the those who are actually coming into the country, instead of being put up in hotels, they need to be put up in properties. What sort
like
of
everybody else, the hotels is a terrible idea anyway. It's a terrible idea. The government was paying a fortune for the hotels, and therefore everyone was losing out equally from it. Whereas if they are actually contributing in some way, then at least society is benefiting from their presence. Let me give you some bright spots that are emerging. Apparently, at the moment, there's a perceiving slowing rental growth. Rent increases have noticeably decelerated. Latest data shows annual rent growth at just 2.8%, which is the lowest pace in 4 years. There's slight easing of affordability pressures. This slowdown offers a tiny bit of breathing space, but affordability is the most significant issue, both on rentals and purchases. And the future growth forecasts from Savills and Langford Ray, they show that they expect more manageable rental growth, between 3 to 4% annually throughout this year, bringing a little bit of more predictability. And predictability has been also a big problem for the landlord. The overall outlook apparently is for 2025 rent growth slowing, approximately 2.8 to 4%. Stock gradually improving, apparently. The forecast for 2026 to 2028, continued modest growth, affordability may cap rent increases. Well, that would be interesting. And beyond that, what is overall hoped for is sustained relief hinging completely on new housing supply. So that's the big skinny. The only way we're going to stem the current unaffordable rental costs is by filling the market with availability. What do you think?
Sadly, of course we can't guarantee that.
No.
Any more than we can guarantee who is actually going to be taking on these properties. One of the great advantages, of course, of this, if you like, the smaller landlord in terms of the number of properties held, there is a tendency to get far better. Although ignore what some of the big charities say, like your shelters and the rest of them, the better support you're receiving will be from that smaller landlord who takes an interest to get to know their clients and all the rest of it, and even celebrates things like their birthdays and all sorts of things of that particular nature, because they want to get on well with their clients. Now, big business doesn't need to, because as soon if somebody goes out, they can just grab somebody else in. That's unless the place is falling apart. We've got a lot of those happening as well, as it sort of happens. There are some appalling properties. Well, London's a typical place, but there's some appalling properties there which were the larger companies did actually take on, and they were purely they set up for rental purposes. Right. And they're in a desperate sort of state that people cannot actually live in them at the moment because of the state that they're actually in, with all the leakages and all sorts of various things.
But apparently there's an overall increase in willingness to fix these problems and to clean up their act. I mean, well, apparently overall, that there will be hotspots where landlords aren't doing what they're supposed to, or where tenants are acting out and leaving places like tips. But in between, overall, there seems to be a willingness to try and make things fairer for the tenant. Now, obviously, there's a focus now, potentially legislation going through that will help tenancies. But the net effect is, whenever you swing the pendulum one way or the other, either the landlord loses out and the tenant gains, or the tenant loses out and the landlord gains. Personally, I would prefer if we could try and chart a course somewhere down the middle, but I don't think that's ever going to happen. It always seems to swing one way or the other.
I think I'd have to go along with that, and I think the major impact is going to be the majority of properties that do come onto the market or are built will be built because the people are going to be investing in them. The people who are going to be investing in them will be those larger companies, and the larger companies is that sort of upswelling. There's the loss of relationship between if you like, the owners of the company. I mean, all we've got to do to see how this happens, you look at someone like Thames Water, yes, providing water. I mean, it's worthless water. It doesn't cost you actually to sort of gather the water because it rains. So you've got free supply there. With a house, you've got to build it. But look what happened to Thames Water. Anybody could buy into it. So they sold it off to all sorts of different people who made remarkable use of all those additional loans they could get to end them up in a complete and utter absolute sort of shambles. And there everybody's sort of stuck, and where everybody's having to sort of pay more for it. And I'm very, very concerned that when we do get a situation where the majority of properties available are available through the large corporate landlords and even the councils, for that matter, because the councils themselves are not the best at looking after their clients,
No,
as we well know,
no.
in their rental accommodation.
I mean, it should be mentioned that this form of rental is commonplace in Germany, whereby large landlords, large companies own the vast majority of rental accommodation and rent them out. But their rentals are much more regulated there. So, it is still relatively affordable. We need to get a foothold on the affordability ladder. Otherwise, we're going to end up in a situation where only the most well-heeled can afford to rent in the first place, and then we're back to how do we house the majority of people who can't afford to buy a house? Hamish, would you kindly sum up?
We're back. This word comes up frequently, and I think probably every podcast we've had over this month has mentioned this tremendous word, balance. It is a matter of trying to get that balance right, and it would be so much if we could create the balance which enabled the private landlord, that smaller landlord, to actually get those properties together. It's a great portfolio for their future and their sort of family's future. They found ways around doing it. They're trying to make them into sort of trust funds and various things like that, and the business taking them over rather than individual ownership. But they haven't been able to do anything like replacing the numbers. So we've got this balance that, as we sort of said, it will increase the number of availability of these properties with additional house build, with the additional flat build. And let us hope when they build all of these things, they are looking into safety at the same time, because we did find last week with one of our visitors that came, and this was a big shock, because they were speaking about not high level flats. All we're speaking about all these low level flats they live in, which council would like to see get rid of. I mean, they prefer 25 stories to somebody with 3 or 4 stories. You think how many more people you can stuff into those, like Royal Artillery Quays, without bothering about the safety, of course. But that's another story. We'll save that till Friday. Balance, please. Get the right properties built, and let's see if we can get a balance between, like HMOs are a great advantage. They have a great prospect for a number of people. The full rental of a property, that's great for people. The flats are great for people, but it's nice to have a mixture of landlords at the same time.
Well, there you heard it. There could be so much positivity here, and I entreat landlords, think before you skip or jump ship. Remember, you're providing a valuable service for people who have no real other option. And to all of you out there, thank you so much for watching. As I said, hopefully next week normal service will be returned to. We'll have a wonderful people to have on board as other experts other than Hamish, and we look forward to seeing you then. Until next week, get your feet on the ground, keep reaching for the stars, and please do try and look after that mental health. Until next week, bye bye.